Guten gardening, everybody. I'm super excited for today's video. It's a little bit of a different video, but one I hope you as a community are ready and willing to engage in, because today I've been thinking, and that's actually something that's been on my mind for the last couple of weeks especially, but I've been thinking about the rationale behind gardening. And we did a video series about a year ago, a Why We Garden series. We talked about the harvest. We talked about a lot of different pieces there, feeding our family. But I was thinking about what really gets someone inspired enough to take the first step in gardening, to start that gardening process. And I believe one of the things that really got me thinking about this idea of what was that first step, that first draw into gardening, is actually from one of our recent trips. So we were in Seattle and we went to the zoo there, which is something our family loves to do. One of the things we noticed was this really cool setup, and I guess it's something now since we had that experience in Syracuse, New York at the zoo there, looking at that beautiful garden. But we noticed a small gardening setup, but there was basically a written conversation, different signage talking about reasons why it's a good idea to garden, or the different aspects and elements of what you can do in a personal garden. There were a few squash plants growing, some blueberry plants, the biggest rosemary plant I've ever seen in my life. It was absolutely massive, and I suppose it's massive compared to what we grow here, because typically, unless we overwinter indoors, it's going to die back here in zone 5. But man, that thing was a massive plant. But then beyond that, there was a place where they were doing compost. And while there was talk of traditional composting, there was also a vermiculture set up there and a conversation written out as to why vermiculture, a worm bin, was a good idea for composting. There was another area where they had a rain barrel set up and they talked about collecting rainwater. And there was a place talking about the importance of attracting pollinators and bees. I mean, all of that was there, and I started thinking, does something like that work? Does seeing that kind of signage actually inspire you to want to garden, or is it usually something else? In a way, I think of this like a Costco or one of those places that gives you little samples, and you try it, and maybe you're enticed to go and buy the full product. Well, you see a sample of what, or you read some information about what it can look like to garden, and then you take that next step. Is that really that inspiring? Is that really something that people do? I mean, we've been pretty clear, I think, in our videos about the purpose behind this YouTube channel. We've decided to share what we do to try to encourage other people to do the same thing, to teach some of what we're learning along the way, to share our successes and our failures, etc. But what is it that really drags someone in, that really gets them into the process of gardening? And so here I am. I'm thinking about all these things from me, experiences as a child, experiences with my grandparents, but really that realization that we have to grow more of our own food. It's healthier, it's better for our family. That's a piece of it. But was there one thing for me, one thing for my family? Was it that one experience, growing that first squash plant, harvesting that first piece that became then an addictive piece of, I've got to expand, I've got to expand. I'll give you an example of what I mean. We've done more than just a few tours here on our property, and if you look back at the early videos to now, you should know that even in the last 3 years, we've expanded our growing space pretty exponentially. And what I mean by that is, there is not a lot of yard space left here. In fact, we've got this Japanese maple tree at the front of our property, and the Japanese maple tree is my favorite tree. There you go, a piece of information about me. I absolutely love the Japanese maple tree. I think that color of red is beautiful, but ours has been in the ground for 4 or 5 years, maybe longer, and it's struggling. There's something that's got a hold of it, some disease, I think, but the leaves are wilting back. And to be honest, rather than thinking, oh, what's the best way to fix this tree, I've been thinking lately, maybe I should take this tree up, because that area could provide us 3 or 4 more small beds for more garden space. And I think that's what happens a lot of times. You get started with gardening, and if you have space to allocate, it becomes well, bigger picture, it becomes a bigger part of what you have. You start thinking, how can I do more? How can I do more? And really for us, that's what has happened. We've expanded. We're using as much of our property, or nearly as much as we can, and we're thinking of other ways, growing vertically in our green stalks, etc., to take even more advantage. But what we want from you, what we would love to hear from you, is that initial driving force. So no matter how much you're gardening now, maybe it's one container, maybe it's one single plant inside, we want to know what led you to that beginning of gardening. I read a statistic, and this has been a couple years now, but something like a 40% increase, and I'll have to look the exact numbers here. I'm not sure that they can ever tell the exact numbers, but there was something like a 40% increase at the beginning of the pandemic, at the beginning of 2020, in the number of people gardening. And I'm guessing that a large number of those stayed with it, even as food supplies, etc., opened back up. But maybe for you, that was the reason you started gardening, that fear of a lack of food, the need to circumvent that food chain supply issue. Or maybe it was just something that, the life of your family is around gardening, and you grew up in that environment. You had relatives, you had family who gardened, and it just came natural. Or maybe you got tired of being in a space with no greenery around you, and you decided to take that first step. We want to know, and we'd love to hear your story in the description. I was thinking about what a future live stream for us could look like, and I think it would be really cool to be able to share some of our community members' stories as to why they got into gardening, because I think what can happen is, if you realize how similar or how many other people do this the same way, start for the same reasons, or just how many different perspectives there are out there when it comes to gardening, that could be its own form of inspiration. I'm sitting here surrounded by green. It's late September in Zone 5, Wisconsin, and I've got tomatoes behind me, I've got squash, I've got Brussels sprouts, I've got all of this around me, and I know I've made the right decision getting into this gardening life and really spending my time out here. I know that for a fact. And maybe garden therapy was your rationale. You heard someone say getting your hands down into that soil was life-changing. I'll tell you, it is 100% true. Maybe it was that first taste that somebody came to work and said, hey, I've got a bunch of extra cucumbers, I got a bunch of extra summer squash, I've got a bunch of tomatoes here, and you tried one and you said, that's not what I'm used to tasting at the store. What was it that got you started? We'd love to hear about it in as detailed a fashion as possible in the comments. And look, I know I'm not the best at getting back to you in your comments every single time. I'm working on it. I'm also a full-time teacher. I've got a lot of other things to do as well, but I really value you as our community. I value the comments. I promise you, I read every single one, and I'm going to do my best to be better at responding as well. But we'd love to hear from you. Love to hear your garden beginnings story. Folks, thank you so much for being a part of our community. Thank you so much for sharing this amazing experience of being outside and being in the garden. We hope you enjoyed today's video. We look forward to hearing from you. If you did enjoy today's video, don't forget to give us a like, leave us a comment, remember to share and subscribe, and most importantly, remember, when you're with us, you are good to grow.